Sanjaks. The districts which made up a province were known as Sanjaks, each under the command of a district governor or Sanjak Bey, lord of a Sanjak and Apas. The number of Sanjaks in each province varied considerably. In 1609, Ain Ali noted that Rumelia had 24 Sanjaks, but that 6 of these in the Peloponnesos had been detached to form a separate province of the Morea. Anatolia had 14 and the province of Damascus 11. There were, in addition, several provinces where there was no formal division into Sanjaks. These, in Ain Ali's list, were Basra and part of the province of Baghdad in Iraq, Al-Hassa in northeastern Arabia, and Egypt, Tripoli, Tunis and Algiers in North Africa. He adds to the list Yemen, with the note that, at the moment the Imams have usurped control in Apas. These provinces were, however, exceptional. The typical pattern was the province subdivided into Sanjaks. By the 16th century, these presented a rational administrative pattern of territories, based, usually around the town or settlement from which the Sanjak took its name, and with a population of perhaps 100,011. However, this had not always been the case. It seems more likely that before the mid-15th century, the most important factor in determining the pattern of Sanjaks was the existence of former lordships and principalities, and of areas where marcher lords had acquired territories for themselves and their followers. Some Sanjaks in fact preserved the names of the dynasties that had ruled there before the Ottoman conquest. The most striking cluster of such names appears in western Anatolia, between the Aegean and Mediterranean coasts and the high plateau. Here the Sanjaks of Karasi, Saruhan, Aydin, Mentish, Jermian, Hamid, and Teke preserve the names of the pre-conquest dynasties. In Rumelia, Kustendil in Bulgaria is a contraction of Constantine Eli and Apas. Constantine's land, named after its lord Constantine Djanovic and Apas, killed in battle in 1395. Karlili, Carlo's land, in Epirus preserves the memory of its former lord, Carlo Taco, who died in 1429. The name of the Sanjak of Dukakan in northern Albania is a reminder of the rule there of the Dukagjan, Dukjan, clan. Jacopo de Promontorio's list of the, in his time, 17 Sanjaks of Rumelia also gives a sense of how the Ottoman administration preserved the boundaries of pre-Ottoman lordships. Albania he divides into 2, Aranides Albania, comprising the lands to the south, belonging until the early 15th century to the Aranidi clan, and Skanderbegs Albania, comprising land further north which had belonged to the Kastriot family, and especially to its most famous member, Skanderbeg, who had resisted Ottoman rule between 1444 and 1466. Bosnia, in the same list, appears as 2 Sanjaks, the self-explanatory Kingdom of Bosnia and the other Bosnia, presumably Herzegovina. Serbia, 2, Jacopo divides into Lazar's Serbia, referring to the territory of Prince Lazar, who had lost his life at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, and the despot Serbia, presumably the lands of George Brankovic along the Danube. In the immediate aftermath of the conquest, Ottoman Sanjaks preserved more than the names of their former rulers. Where early cadastral registers of the conquered lands survive, they often reveal the names of fief holders who had evidently occupied the same position before the conquest. For example, the cadastral survey of southern Albania, dated 1431, shows a number of Christian fief holders, who were clearly survivors from the previous regimes. On the eastern border of the empire, the first Ottoman survey of the Sanjak of Amid, made in 1518-12 designates a group of fief holders as Akoyunlu, evidently clansmen or appointees of the Akoyunlu dynasty that had ruled the area until 1503. These survivors provided continuity between the old order and the new. Nonetheless, it is equally clear that the new Ottoman rulers sought to counterbalance the influence of these representatives of the old regime by also awarding fiefs in the newly conquered districts to men from distant areas of the empire. The 1431 survey of Albania shows a group of fief holders as being from Saruhan and Apas. This was the old principality in western Anatolia, which Mehmed I had finally annexed in 1417, at about the same time as his forces had occupied southern Albania. What Mehmed clearly did was to remove the fief holders from Saruhan, where they had local connections, and transferred them to Albania, where they had none. Their only source of patronage and protection was the Ottoman Sultan, whose interests they would therefore defend from local challenges. The 1518 survey of Amid shows the same principle at work. The Akoyanlis and the Sanjak held fiefs of a modest value. The highest valued fief went to a man registered as being from Rumelia and Apas. The practice of counterbalancing local with alien fief holders in newly conquered lands probably dates from the early 15th century. At the Battle of Ankara in 1402, a major cause of Bayezid I's defeat was the desertion to Timur of troops from the old principalities of western Anatolia, which Bayezid had annexed in 1390. These men deserted when they saw their former lords in Timur's army. It was perhaps this experience that convinced the sultans of the need to draft foreign elements into newly conquered districts as a counterweight to the local power holders that had survived the change of regime, and to deport some of the local men to distant provinces, where they had no connections. Immediately after the conquest, therefore, an Ottoman Sanjak would often retain the boundaries of a pre-Ottoman lordship, and usually have a fief-holding elite composed of survivors from the old regime and new settlers and deportees. Within a generation, the survivors and their descendants would often have lost their non-Ottoman identity, notably through the conversion of Christians to Islam. With their assimilation, an area which had been an independent principality, or part of one, would become a standard Ottoman Sanjak. 13 The passage of time could also bring changes in Sanjak boundaries. For example, the Venetian Loro Quirini's list of Sanjaks, which seems to reflect the position in the 1430s, lists Bergama and Manisa as independent units. 14 By the time of Jacopo da Promontorio, in 1475, they had become part of the Sanjaks of Karasi and Saruhan, respectively. Not all provinces and Sanjaks, however, completely lost their special identity. The difficulties that Mehmed II and Bayezid II, 1481–1512, had in suppressing the dynasty of Karaman indicate how strong local particularism could be. Furthermore, a few notables retained hereditary rights to governorships. Prominent among these were the Marcher Lords, 15 who already in the 14th century had emerged as a political force in Rumelia. Their origins are unclear, but some had clearly converted to Islam and joined the invading Turks. The name of one of these families, Mihaglu, Michelson, was so clearly Christian that during the 15th century a legend emerged, describing the conversion of the first Michael and his association with Osman, the first of the Ottoman line. 16 The name of another Marcher family, Malkakolu, also appears to be a Turkish form of the Slavonic Markovich, suggesting that these were descendants of Marko, a Macedonian lord, whose father, Vkashin, had lost his life at the Battle of the Maritsa in 1371. However, the greatest of the Marcher lords to emerge in the 14th century was Evrenos, whose tombstone records his father's name as Isa, indicating a Muslim Turkish descent. 17 The names of the other Marcher lords, such as Turahan, that emerge in the first half of the 15th century also suggest Turkish origins. These lords not only commanded the Ottoman armies in Rumelia, but also exercised political power. Evrenos, for example, was a negotiator at the discussions leading to the Treaty of Gallipoli in 1403. His son, Barak, conducted negotiations with Venice in 1409. Mihaglu, Mehmed served both Prince Suleiman and Prince Musa during the Civil War of 1402–13. His desertion to Prince Mehmed in 1411 was a major factor in Musa's defeat. Most importantly, however, the Marcher lords emerged as territorial magnates. The nucleus of Evrenos's vast holdings was around Ioannitsa in the Vardar Valley to the west of Thessaloniki, while the Mihaglis were lords of Vidin, on the Danube in northwestern Bulgaria. As territorial lords, they and their descendants retained hereditary rights to governorships in Rumelia. Loro Quirini, for example, records a Sanjak in central Greece under the name of its lord, Turahan. 18 This Sanjak had disappeared by the time Jacopo made his list in 1475, but the family of Turahan continued to occupy positions as Sanjak governors. Evrenos, on the other hand, appears in the lists of both Loro and Jacopo as the designation of the Sanjak comprising this family's lands. In Macedonia, Jacopo adds the note, a great lord, formerly Ali Bey, son of Evrenos. Of the 1,500 warriors in the Sanjak, the majority are his slaves and apos. By the 16th century, the name Evrenos as the designation of a Sanjak had disappeared, although the family's lands remained intact, and family members retained a hereditary right to governorships. The 1527 list of Sanjaks records a member of the Evrenos family as governor of Krus-Vivac in Serbia, and members of the Mihaglu family as Sanjak governors of Vidin and Nikopol, the Danube in Bulgaria. It was to members of the Malkak family that the Sultan assigned the hereditary governorship of Bosnia after its conquest in 1463. The local power and claims to office of the great Marcher lords and their descendants limited the Sultan's discretion in organizing territory and in making appointments to governorships in Rumelia. Nonetheless, it appears that at least from the mid-15th century, the Ottoman rulers attempted to restrict their influence. They no longer, it appears, had a part in the central councils of government, as they had done in the 14th and early 15th centuries, and it would seem none of them rose beyond the rank of Sanjak governor. The families, however, survived, in the case of the Evrenosolu and Mihaglu families, until today, and their local influence continued. Semi-independent dynasties also survived in some areas of the Anatolian and Arab provinces. These were not, however, descendants of the Ottoman marcher lords, but rather lords who were locally too powerful for the Sultan to remove. For example, in the marshlands of southern Iraq and the desert fringes of Arabia, the sultans tried to gain the allegiance of effectively independent tribal chiefs by giving them the title of Sanjak governor. It was, for example, by these means that Selim II, 1566-74, in 1567 attempted to bring to an end the rebellion of the Marsh Arab, Ibn Ulayyan, in the delta of the Tigris and the Euphrates. 19 In southeastern Turkey, the territories of the Kurdish lords were also semi-independent. These had become part of the empire after the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514, as a result of negotiations with the agent of Selim I, 1512-20, Idris of Bitlis. In 1609, Ain Ali made a note on their formal status. In listing the Sanjaks in the province of Diyarbakir, he notes that it had 10 Ottoman districts and, in addition, 8 districts of the Kurdish lords and Apas. In these cases, when a lord died, the governorship did not go to an outsider, but to his son. In other respects, however, they resembled normal Ottoman Sanjaks, in that the revenues were registered and allocated to fief holders who went to war under their lord. In addition, however, Ain Ali noted that there were 5 sovereign Sanjaks, which their lords disposed of as private property, and which were outside the system of provincial government. Ain Ali records similar independent or semi-independent districts in the province of Suldur in northeastern Turkey and, most famously, in the province of Van where the Khans of Bitlis ruled independently until the 19th century. 20 There were other areas, too, which enjoyed autonomy or semi-autonomy. In the second half of the 16th century, Kilis came under the hereditary governorship of the Janbulid family, while Adana remained under the rule of the pre-Ottoman dynasty of Ramazanalu. In the Lebanon, Ain Ali refers to the Druze chieftains with the note, "There are non-Muslim lords in the mountains." And Apas. There were other autonomous enclaves in the empire, whether or not they received formal recognition as Sanjaks, but, by the 16th century, these were exceptional. Most of the Sanjaks throughout the empire were under the rule of non-hereditary appointees, who had no permanent family of territorial connections with the area. The office of Sanjak governor resembled that of governor-general, on a more modest scale. Like the governor-general, the Sanjak governor drew his income from a prebend, which consisted usually of revenues from the towns, quays and ports within the boundary of his Sanjak. In areas, however, where there was no town, or where revenues which typically went to the Sanjak governor had been assigned to the governor-general or the sultan, then he would also draw his income from agricultural taxes. The first Ottoman cadastral survey of Shkodër in northern Albania, for example, shows that, in 1485, the revenues from the customs, the quay and the fisheries of Lake Boyana had been assigned to the sultan, while the Sanjak governor drew his revenue from the town of Pej and its surrounding villages. A Sanjak governor on his first appointment might receive 150,002, 200,000 akshas per year. By the mid-16th century, 200,000 seems to have been normal. He could, however, receive an increase in his living, either as a reward for effectiveness in battle or for some other reason, or by receiving a new and more lucrative appointment. In the area, a senior Sanjak governor could expect receive 500,002, 600,000 akshas, perhaps while serving in a high-yielding district. 21. Like the governor-general, the Sanjak governor was also a military commander. The term Sanjak means flag or standard and, in times of war, the cavalryman holding fiefs in his Sanjak, gathered under his banner. The troops of each Sanjak, under the command of their governor, would then assemble as an army and fight under the banner of the governor-general of the province. In this way, the structure of command on the battlefield resembled the hierarchy of provincial government. Within his own Sanjak, a governor was responsible above all for maintaining order and, with the cooperation of the fief holders, arresting and punishing wrongdoers. For this, he usually received half of the fines imposed on miscreants, with the fief holder on whose lands the misdeed took place, receiving the other half. Sanjak governors also had other duties, for example, the pursuit of bandits, the investigation of heretics, the provision of supplies for the army, or the dispatch of materials for shipbuilding, as the Sultan commanded. Those on the frontiers might also have special military functions. In the late 15th century, for example, the Sanjak governors of Bosnia had the duty of making annual raids, usually into Hungary. Similarly, the Mihaglu family held not only the hereditary governorship of Vidin, but also the leadership of the raiders, akinjis, the troops who in the 15th and 16th centuries held tax-free lands in Rumelia in exchange for making annual raids across the Danube, or acting as the vanguard and as shock troops for the Ottoman army. Sanjak governors in border regions might equally engage in cross-border negotiations over, for example, the return of escaped slaves or the return of prisoners, in accordance with treaty arrangements. A Sanjak governor did not, however, have authority over all the Sultan's subjects in his district. What defined authority was, above all, the right to collect taxes, and specifically the right to pocket fines. Sanjak governors collected taxes from lands and properties which they held as prebends, and clearly had full authority in these areas, as they also did in the lands assigned to fief holders, where they usually had the right to half the fines. However, some areas or properties would form a prebend of the Sultan or of the Governor General, and a few fiefs were free, meaning that the fief holder kept all fines. In these areas, the Sanjak governor's men had no right of entry. In addition, privately owned lands and properties, and those belonging to trusts did not come under the authority of the Sanjak governor. In this respect, the government within a Sanjak was not uniform. Provinces and Sanjaks were not, however, the only administrative divisions of the empire. Each town and city throughout the Sultan's realms had a judge, who acted as judge and notary within his own judicial district, and also as a royal official implementing the Sultan's commands. The judge, unlike the Sanjak governor, had authority throughout his area, with judgeships forming what has been called a parallel system of administration. 22. Before about 1600, the Sanjak governor, beside the judge, was perhaps the most important figure in Ottoman provincial administration. Nonetheless, the lack of records from before the mid-16th century makes it impossible to know who the Sanjak governors were, or how their careers progressed. Before the 16th century, many would presumably have held hereditary rights as descendants of formerly independent dynasties or lords. Besides these, the sultans must have appointed some men raised in their own household. By the 16th century, a clearer pattern had emerged. As had been the case since the 14th century, sons of the reigning sultan received Sanjak governorships on reaching the age of puberty. According to the so-called law book of Mehmed the Conqueror, male members of the royal family descended in the female line also had the right to receive a Sanjak governorship, but no higher appointment than this. The families of the marcher lords of Rumelia also had an automatic right, either to a governorship in general or to a specific district. In eastern Turkey and northern Iraq, the Kurdish lords and governors of sovereign Sanjaks ruled by dynastic right. Far more Sanjak governors, however, were graduates of the palace and, in this sense, members of the Sultan's own household. A law book from the reign of Selim II in fact lists the 15 agas of the stirrup who were qualified for governorships. These were the Aga of the Janissaries and his second in command, the commanders of the 6 divisions of the palace cavalry, the chancellor, the master of the standard, the head gatekeeper, the master of the stable, the head taster and the head falconer. 23 and 1609, Ain Ali was to repeat this list, with a few omissions. It is not clear whether promotion to Sanjak governor was ever quite so clear-cut as the law book implies, but some careers certainly follow this pattern. Lutfi Pasha, for example, who was to become Grand Vizier in 1539, served as master of the standard and head gatekeeper in the palace before going out to become Sanjak governor of Kastamonu. Sokollu Mehmed, who was to become Grand Vizier in 1566, served as head gatekeeper before going out in 1546 as Sanjak governor of Gallipoli, and admiral. However, Sanjak governors who had graduated directly from these senior positions in the palace formed a minority. There were many more who had moved from the palace or service of the central government to a lesser post in the provincial government, such as intendant of the registers of fiefs, and from there advanced to become a Sanjak governor. In the 1570s, over a third of provincial governors had reached their position through this route. A smaller group, a little over 10% at this time, owed their rise to being a blood relative or member of the household of a governor. This pattern of recruitment to governorships was probably typical of the 16th century up until the 1580s. 25. The tenure of a Sanjak governor was usually less than 3 years. As a rule, he could expect reappointment in a different Sanjak, often in the same province or region, and often with the possibility of an increase in the value of his prebend. The procedure for reappointment is not, in all details, clear. Records indicate that it was the Governor General who made the recommendation on behalf of the candidate, who would then perhaps present it to the Grand Vizier for recommendation to the Sultan. When the Sultan had approved, the Imperial Council would send a decree to the Governor General, informing him of the appointment, and ordering him to assemble the prebends from which the new Sanjak governor was to draw his income. The governor-general would then give the candidate a memorandum of appointment to take to the palace, where he would receive letters patent conferring on him his new position. It was at this stage that he officially assumed office. 26. Sanjak governors did not, therefore, make their career in a single Sanjak. Each posting was, as a rule, of short duration, although the moves from district to district did allow for increases in income with each new posting. Furthermore, during the 15th and 16th centuries, to hold office as a Sanjak governor was, as a rule, a necessary step in seeking promotion to governor-general. Outside the hereditary Sanjaks, however, each appointment was in the gift of the sultan, and frequent moves prevented any governor from gaining a powerful local following and establishing himself as an autonomous lord.